Hello, Hunger 114ers, and happy April 2nd. I'm not sure if you guys did anything for April Fool's Day. I totally forgot. Usually my family and I are up to pranks in the house, but I think we just totally forgot what day it is. We're not even sure sometimes what hour or month it is, given all of the interesting disruptions that we've experienced. So this is just a follow-up today to the Thursday discussion section groups that we had, just like we had last week. So I have a bit of lecture follow-up, try to keep, again, this short, my famous last words every time. But we're beginning to transition in the course to think a little bit more broadly about how conflict generates change, and specifically how conflict generates displacement, how it forces people to leave their homes. Our story with Nicholas is one where Nicholas is always on the move. He rarely stops. Many of you have observed, even in your discussion threads, how the story seems to have this kind of dynamic of movement. People are on the move. They're working hard to save the cherished possessions that they have. I think as you read the story, I wonder if you read the story, if you identify in new ways with the characters who find themselves leaving quickly a place they love and trying to gather a few things to take with them, put in their backpack so that they can remember someone they left behind, remember a place they left behind. Certainly in our season of displacement, leaving Wheaton just 3 weeks ago and finding ourselves back at home or finding ourselves in an unfamiliar place. Maybe there's something in the story that you identify with that maybe before would have been hard to identify with. So what I want to do today is just to talk a little bit about how the war displaced people. And I want to go through a few slides and to think what the displacement that happened in the 1980s, even before that, the 1970s and 1980s, how it's connected to patterns of migration from Central America to other parts of the Americas today. So we're going to try to begin to answer another one of our key questions for the unit, which is what's the relationship between past patterns of violence and displacement and current patterns of migration and displacement. So let me share with you the PowerPoint that we're going to go through just quickly, and then we will close out with some suggested videos, which are phenomenal. I want to make sure that you watch them between now and next Tuesday's class. So I begin here with an image taken by a photographer, activist photographer, and I'm going to give you a link to his site here in a second, of Salvadoran families who find themselves displaced from northern El Salvador. Nearby, where they used to live, nearby was the village of El Mozote and other villages that were caught up in the wave of state-sponsored violence in 1980 and 81. But this is a group of women and they're mostly their daughters, it looks like, gathered here at a stream where they're all crowded together carrying out daily chores, namely washing clothes. And these families mostly are from the Morazan area, which suffered significant violence in 1980 and 81, as we've read. And they're all at a refugee camp in a place called Colomancagua, Honduras, which is on the border of Honduras and El Salvador. It was estimated at the time that some 35,000 Salvadorans fled northern El Salvador and tried to make a new life temporarily in refugee camp in Honduras. And this is what the refugee camp looks like, right? Very kind of all of the sudden settlement, if you will, of imagine tens of thousands of people here. They're gathering for a weekly community meeting with representatives from the United Nations. The UNHCR, High Commission for Refugees, was involved in trying to help resettle and support and provide aid for people who were displaced from their homes and their farms in northern El Salvador because of the violence, and now found themselves as refugees in another country, namely Honduras. And as we've learned in our story, right, so many people are displaced. In fact, our story, The Weight of All Things, ends with a bunch of people, displaced people, showing up and in sort of interrupting, if you will, our story with Nicholas. And Nicholas and Tata and Basilio joined them with every intention to crossing into Honduras. But they're met there at the border by Honduran army soldiers and Salvadorans who begin to open fire, right, in the infamous and terrible Sumpul River massacre that occurred in, I believe, in May of 1980. So there's movement, and that's kind of the point of today's little mini lecture follow-up. Lots of movement is generated all throughout Central America because of the civil wars, Nicaraguan, Guatemalan, and Salvadoran wars, conflicts that are unfolding in the 70s and 80s. This is a group of Guatemalan refugee women, again, trying to carry out ordinary life in what looks almost like to be a, can't really tell, but a very large building where refugees are being housed. And here the women are working a sort of a makeshift oven to prepare tortillas, right? Again, bits of home, routines of home, traveling with people, in this case into Mexico. Salvadorans, the people of El Salvador have been on the move, or at least a portion of them, for quite some time. And we're going to be thinking next week specifically about not only how Salvadorans account for one of the major origin countries of migrants and asylum seekers globally, but how many, many other places, because of conflict and because of many other factors and causes, namely natural disasters, people often leave their homes forcibly, right? They just don't wake up and decide to leave. They find themselves in a situation or in a context, a scenario where it's frankly unsafe to continue to remain, where there are very few options left to provide a livelihood for oneself and one's family, and to securely and safely live in the community that one grew up in. So El Salvador has for some time been a place of people on the move. This was initially sort of started in the, as we've already read, in the late 1800s, if not even earlier, and continued on into the 1900s, of people being internally displaced by different economic and political processes. Namely, for example, a key example that we talked about was the privatization of land by the Salvadoran government, which made it illegal to have land tenure systems that were communal, and the subsequent privatization of land and the concentration of that land into the hands of a relatively tiny agrarian elite meant it displaced a lot of people from lands that they had previously owned communally. This displacement of people created a whole group of what have been called landless peasants, farmers, people who farm for a living, who had to work on someone else's land to earn a living, and or rent a piece of land and pay a portion of their harvest to the landowner in order to carry on with their livelihoods, not unlike Nathan and Rukmani. So far, what we're seeing, right, in the late 1800s and 1900s is the movement of people within El Salvador being displaced by different economic and political forces. In the 20th century, we begin to see the movement of people across borders. And this is where people go from being internally displaced to what we call refugees, someone who leaves or migrates, in this case, to another nation state because of some sort of persecution or fear of persecution in their home nation state. In this case, there were at first groups of Salvadorans leaving El Salvador to go and work in Honduras. These were not refugees, they were simply what we might call economic migrants. We'll talk more about these terms next week. But they leave in search of work. Many of them end up working on farms, right? Farms that were generating all sorts of bananas for consumers in the north, namely farms owned by Chiquita and United Fruit Company. Honduras, by the way, if you didn't know this, is the original, quote, banana republic. It was called that long before there was ever a store where you could buy skinny jeans and dress shirts. So early on in the 20th century, and it continues, people in El Salvador are moving for a variety of reasons. And this is where later on in the 20th century, where we begin to see people being displaced by conflict, right? not just forcibly displaced because of economic and political processes that are moving them off their land. Now there's conflict either between, in this case, El Salvador and Honduras. There was something called the Soccer War in 1971, where the Salvadorans that had earlier left El Salvador to go and work in Honduras are forced to go back to El Salvador as a result of this war. Some 300,000 are forced back to El Salvador, and when they get there, they themselves find themselves in a dire situation, mostly because they don't have land to work on. They are, again, another group, in this case, some 300,000 Salvadorans pushed out of Honduras back into El Salvador and don't have a livelihood when they return, or at least limited opportunities for that. And then, of course, there's the Civil War, and this has been the focus of our time together. The Civil War generated significant displacement. That goes without saying. That's what we've been reading. The number of people who were displaced by the Civil War is at the time equivalent to 1/5 of the total population. To put that in perspective, that's equal to today some 66 million people in the United States being displaced, either internally, they have to leave one state and go to another because of conflict happening, or they leave the United States altogether and go live in Mexico or Canada or somewhere else in the world. That's 66 million people, right, of the 330 million that live in the United States being displaced by a conflict. So that to kind of give you a little perspective, how many folks, right? 1 out of 5 is a lot. Many of the Salvadorans are like Nicholas. They are internally displaced. Others leave El Salvador and go to neighboring countries where they are, at that point, a refugee. And then some others make their way all the way to Mexico, United States, Canada, and there is a Salvadoran community in Australia, actually. There are refugees camps set up by the United Nations in Costa Rica, Honduras, and Panama. And what we'll see next week is that conflict-induced displacement, that's what it's technically called, has the greatest impact on neighboring countries. This is true today, for example, with Turkey, which is home to most of the Syrian refugees in the world today, and also in Lebanon. So the burden of displacement is not equally shared by all nation states. And we'll talk more about that next week. 500,000 of the million or so make their way to the United States. And this is where things get interesting and will bring us up to some of the discussions that we'll be having next week about US policy and immigration. So notice this. So 500,000 Salvadorans flee to the United States. Before the 1970s and 80s, there wasn't a very big Salvadoran population in the United States. The Civil War disrupts life to the extent that 1/5 of the Salvadoran population is on the move, and many of them leave El Salvador. When they get to the United States, they apply for asylum. However, the US government at the time only grants 2% of the 500,000 applicants asylum in the United States. And we'll talk more about what asylum means later. You're certainly welcome to Google it. But essentially, Salvadorans are making a claim to the United States government that their home country is, and specifically their government, is persecuting them to such an extent that it is completely unsafe for them to remain in El Salvador. And in this case, they are asking for asylum in a neighboring nation state, protection, the opportunity to work, the opportunity to live for a period of time, perhaps even indefinitely if they were to become a nationalized citizen. But the United States at the time only grants 2%. And why? Well, according to one article that I reviewed, and one that an author and sociologist that I have tremendous respect for, a sociologist, Cecilia Manquilar at UCLA, observes in a piece that she wrote in 2018 that the US government was reluctant, it's putting it mildly, to extend protection to Salvadoran asylum seekers because doing so would have contradicted its own foreign policy. So think about that for just a bit. You may have questions why. We can talk about that next week, but think about why the United States is reluctant. It's reluctant, according to Manquilar, and I would affirm her assessment, Because to grant people fleeing government persecution asylum in the United States would then, the United States would then be admitting that it was supporting a government that was persecuting its own people. So what does this mean? For Salvadorans at the time, it meant that they came to the United States. They were not granted refugee status. They were not granted legal asylum. This means that a large number of the 500,000 who came here eventually and even from the beginning, were identified as undocumented immigrants. In other words, they were what some people call illegal aliens. They had no legal right before the US government to be in the United States, to remain. But note this, and this is something that we've all been wondering about, and it's a really amazing and interesting case that I encourage you to go learn more about. There were a lot of religious, faith-based activists and Central American immigrant organizations, human rights organizations, who found the US government's response to asylum seekers to be completely unjust. So a group filed with the US Supreme Court, called the American Baptist Churches versus Thornburg trial, a lawsuit against the US government. So here we see religious actors working with human rights organizations to stand up. In this case, they're trying to stand up for the well-being of immigrants, in this case, asylum-seeking Salvadorans and Guatemalans who are trying to find refuge in the United States. They file this lawsuit against the United States government. The lawsuit in particular protests the US government's asylum policies towards two particular groups of migrants, namely Salvadorans and Guatemalans, and they win. The plaintiffs, namely the churches, win the lawsuit, which grants people from El Salvador and Guatemala who had come to the United States during this period of time the opportunity to reapply for asylum, and I think just as significantly, obtain work permits while they wait for their asylum case to be heard. In other words, they now have the opportunity to make a living in the United States with permission of the US government. This is a massive case, and I would encourage you to go and learn more about its long-term implications and ramifications for Salvadorans and Guatemalans and other Central Americans in the United States at the time. So this brings us to the present, and this is what we're going to be talking about next week. No doubt, many of you have paid attention to the news over the last few years of people seeking asylum again. People from Central America, namely from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, again at the border of the United States and Mexico. Many of them are families, and many, surprisingly, for a lot of analysts, and at least since 2016, have included children, adolescents, oftentimes unaccompanied minors. And so what we're going to be thinking about, right, and here's a picture of the infamous migrant caravan. I wonder if many of you remember this unfolding in October of 2018, now almost 2 years ago, or in fact, 2 years ago, or not quite there, a year and a half ago. But these scenes, right, are important because, well, they're important for many reasons, but at least for our discussion, what we're trying to think about in this particular part of the unit is, well, what's the relationship with this scene today and with past scenes of Salvadorans and Guatemalans fleeing their countries for refuge elsewhere? How are they related? And that's the question I want to end with, and that's the question that I want you to consider as you look at a few films and read a few readings to finish out today's Thursday's lecture discussion. So I've included a few videos which are phenomenal, also quite sobering, maybe a little disturbing, but very informative and very interesting. Have a variety of opinions and perspectives and viewpoints. I'm just providing them for you to take a look at how the analysts and the producers of these videos explain the relationship between past patterns of violence and displacement in Central America and present patterns and dynamics of migration and displacement today. That's kind of what I want you to think about, because that's what we're going to be talking about a lot next week. There's a video from PBS that talks a bit about the current patterns of violence in El Salvador and how it's pushing many people from El Salvador to live elsewhere Interestingly enough, people who leave El Salvador today because of gang violence find it difficult to gain asylum elsewhere. And you can think about why that might be the case, what might be problematic or at least challenging of definitions of refugees that would make it difficult for someone to claim asylum. And then the final video that I want you to consider is one that really is inspiring and sobering about, again, how it is that faith-based actors, specifically Salvadoran Christians, are responding to current patterns of violence today. I encourage you to take a look at the video. I encourage you to pray for your brothers and sisters who are working very hard in difficult situations presently in El Salvador, who are on the front lines, if you will, although I don't like that metaphor, but certainly are rolling up their sleeves and exercising a whole lot of creativity and energy to address problems of violence today in their communities. Thanks again for being with me today. It was great talking with each of the groups. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I hope you enjoy these videos. Be sure to take notes. If you have any questions, let me know. See y'all later.